Imagine you are walking along a muddy road somewhere in medieval Europe. The sun has dipped below the horizon, and the countryside grows quiet, except for the occasional bark of a dog far away. You are not a wealthy merchant, and certainly not a noble knight. You are just a peasant, carrying a small bundle, perhaps after visiting a distant market or being sent on a task by your landlord. And now, as the sky darkens, one question presses on your mind. Where will you sleep tonight? In our world today, it is easy to take comfort for granted. We scroll on a phone, tap a few buttons, and a hotel bed awaits us. Even the simplest hostel offers a roof, a mattress, perhaps a lock on the door. But for peasants centuries ago, the reality was much harsher. To travel was already unusual. Most villagers rarely ventured beyond a day's walk from their homes. And when they did, the challenge of finding a place to stay was as real as the journey itself. There were no cozy inns waiting at every corner. The few roadside taverns or alehouses that existed could be noisy, crowded, and often too expensive for someone who worked the land. Charitable monasteries might offer a bed or at least a patch of floor, but hospitality was not guaranteed. And then, of course, there was a final option: sleeping under the open sky, in a barn if you were lucky, or in a hedgerow if you were not. This is a quieter side of history, the kind that rarely makes it into grand tales of kings and battles. Yet it is a history of ordinary people, of families and travelers, searching not for glory but for a safe corner to rest. Their experiences tell us something about survival, about human dignity, and about the small comforts that matter most. In this video, we will wander with them. First, we'll step into the noisy glow of roadside inns, where peasants and travelers might share a straw bed with strangers. Then we'll pass through the stone gates of monasteries, places of prayer and charity that sometimes open their doors to the weary poor. And finally, we'll face the reality of sleeping rough, in barns, under hedges, or on the hard earth itself. It is not glamorous, and it is certainly not comfortable, but it is a reminder. Through history, people like us have always sought the same simple thing: a safe place to close their eyes. Inns and taverns, the peasant's shelter on the road. Imagine trudging along a dirt road in the 14th century, your sandals caked in mud, the night pressing in. Ahead, you notice a faint flicker of torchlight. As you approach, voices spill into the cold air. Laughter, shouting, the clatter of mugs. You have arrived at an inn, or perhaps just a tavern by the roadside. For a peasant on a journey, this place might be both a blessing and a challenge. Inns and taverns were the first structured form of accommodation available to the medieval traveler. Yet their quality, accessibility, and culture varied widely. For nobles, an inn was a stop on the way to tournaments or court. For peasants, it was often the only alternative to sleeping in a barn or under the open sky. To understand how peasants interacted with these establishments, let's divide the picture into 3 layers. 1. The physical space of inns and taverns. Medieval inns were rarely the romantic timber-frame structures we imagine from films. Most were humble wooden buildings with a large central hall, a hearth for warmth, and a stable attached for animals. In towns, they might be slightly more elaborate, 2 stories, with an open courtyard for carts and horses. But for the countryside peasant, the typical tavern was closer to a farmhouse than a luxury lodge. Common room. The heart of the inn was a common room, where travelers and locals alike gathered. Here, a smoky fire burned, filling the air with the smell of wood and meat. The floor was often dirt or strewn with rushes, replaced only a few times a year. Wooden benches and tables lined the room, sticky with ale, sleeping space. There were no private rooms for peasants. If you could afford to stay, you might share a straw mattress with strangers or sleep on the floor near the hearth. Wealthier travelers might pay extra for a small chamber upstairs. Noise and smell. Imagine the smell of sweat, animals, smoke, spilled beer, and stew all mingling together. The atmosphere was rowdy, sometimes joyful, sometimes threatening for a weary peasant. It could be overwhelming, yet also strangely comforting, proof that you were not alone on the road. 2. The peasant experience. For a poor traveler, the inn was both an opportunity and a gamble. Food and drink. Ale was a staple. A traveler could buy a mug of weak ale, often safer than water, and perhaps a bowl of pottage, a stew of grains, beans, and whatever vegetables were available. Meat was rare unless you were lucky enough to arrive on feast days or had extra coins. Bread, sometimes coarse and dark, filled most bellies. Cost. Prices were inconsistent. In towns, innkeepers charged more, knowing merchants and pilgrims had money. For peasants, this was a burden. Many simply bought a drink and lingered by the fire, hoping the innkeeper would tolerate them. Payment might even be in kind. A few eggs, a loaf of bread, or labor offered in exchange for shelter. Sleeping arrangements. Peasants often had to make do with the floor in the common hall. Shared straw beds, where strangers lay side by side. Bed sharing was common, not just for couples, but for whoever could squeeze in. Privacy was non-existent. Barns or stables. If the inn was full or you could not pay, this was sometimes a mercy. Sleeping with animals could mean warmth in winter, dangers and challenges. Inns were not always safe. Theft was common. Waking up to find your coin purse missing was a real risk. Quarrels between drunken guests sometimes turned violent. For women, especially peasant women traveling alone, the environment could be intimidating or even dangerous. 3. The social role of inns. Beyond food and shelter, inns and taverns played a deeper role in medieval life. Centers of news and gossip. For peasants who rarely traveled, inns were places to hear stories of distant towns, wars, or royal decrees. They were the medieval equivalent of a social network. Community gathering spots. Locals gathered to drink, celebrate, or even hold village meetings. A peasant traveler stepping into an inn would suddenly be part of this buzzing social life. Religious and political importance. During pilgrimages, inns flourished along routes to shrines like Santiago de Compostela or Canterbury. They were also watched closely by authorities, since taverns could become hotbeds of dissent or rebellion. Storytelling moment. A night in the inn. Picture yourself as a 13th century peasant on the road. You push open the door to the inn. Inside, the glow of the hearth flickers on faces young and old. A merchant boasts about the weight of his wares. 2 men argue over dice. A group of farmers laugh over mugs of ale. The innkeeper nods to you but does not rush forward. You are not a wealthy guest. You clutch your few coins and order a bowl of stew. Later, as the fire burns low, you find a patch of floor near the wall. The straw smells faintly of mold, but it is warmer than the night outside. Beside you, a pilgrim snores, while a stranger coughs in his sleep. It is far from luxury, but in that moment, it is enough. You are not on the road, not exposed to wolves or thieves. You close your eyes, grateful. Reflection and modern parallels. Looking back, the inn tells us something essential about human life. Even in the hardest conditions, people have always sought space as a community, however imperfect. For peasants, the inn was not just a roof but a reminder of belonging. Today, we have hotels with locks, heating, and clean bed sheets. Yet TH, Part 3, Monasteries and Religious Hospitality. Introduction, a different kind of shelter. If inns were noisy, smoky, and unpredictable, monasteries offered a very different type of rest. Imagine trudging through the fields as daylight fades, your stomach empty, your back aching from the road. Instead of the sound of laughter and dice rolling, you hear church bells drifting across the valley. Ahead rises the outline of stone walls and cross, a monastery. For peasants on a journey, whether traveling for work, pilgrimage, or to seek better fortune, monasteries were sometimes the safest, most reliable places to rest. Unlike taverns, which existed for profit, monasteries extended hospitality as part of their religious duty. It was not charity in the modern sense, but an expression of faith. To serve the stranger was to serve Christ himself. Let us explore 3 aspects of monasteries as shelters. The physical and spiritual space. What monasteries look like, and how their structure shaped hospitality. The peasant experience, food, shelter, rules, and restrictions. The social and cultural role, why monasteries mattered in the landscape of medieval travel. 1. The physical and spiritual space. Monasteries were designed for prayer, not for travelers. Yet, their very structure, walls, dormitories, kitchens, chapels, made them havens for people on the road. Architecture and layout. Most monasteries were enclosed complexes, stone walls, a church at the center, dormitories for monks, a refectory, dining hall, cloisters for walking, and work areas such as gardens, mills, or breweries. Some larger monasteries had separate guest houses or hospitia, built specifically to receive visitors. These ranged from simple wooden buildings to impressive stone halls, depending on the order's wealth. Atmosphere. Unlike the noisy common room of a tavern, a monastery's guest house was quiet. Instead of dice games, one heard chanting, the rustle of robes, the sound of bells marking the hours of prayer. The space itself was designed to remind guests that they were in a sacred environment. Symbolic meaning. For peasants, entering a monastery was stepping into a holy space. Even the most exhausted traveler might feel awe at the painted crucifixes, stained glass, or the solemn rhythm of the monks' lives. The walls promised not just shelter, but spiritual protection. 2. The peasant experience. What did it mean practically to stay in a monastery as a poor traveler? Food and drink. Monks were known for their agriculture and kitchens. A traveler might be served bread, cheese, and ale brewed on site, sometimes supplemented with vegetables from the monastic garden. Meat was rare, as many monastic orders avoided it, but fish and legumes were common. For a hungry peasant, the fare was simple yet nourishing. Sleeping arrangements. Guest houses varied widely. In wealthy abbeys, a peasant might be given a straw bed in a dormitory. In smaller or poorer monasteries, the floor of a barn or storeroom might serve. Privacy was rare, but the atmosphere was far more orderly and safe than an inn. Rules and restrictions. Hospitality in monasteries came with expectations. Silence. Guests were often expected to keep quiet, especially near the cloisters. Participation. Travelers might be asked to join prayers or attend Mass. Length of stay. Most monasteries limited stays to 1 or 2 nights. Hospitality was generous, but not indefinite. Behavior. Drunkenness, fighting, or disrespect toward the monks could result in immediate expulsion. Cost. Unlike taverns, monasteries did not demand payment. However, offerings were encouraged. A peasant might leave a few coins, a piece of bread, or even promise prayers for the monastery's benefactors. In this sense, hospitality was never entirely free, but it was not transactional in the same way as inns. Safety. For many peasants, safety was the greatest gift. Theft and violence were far less likely inside monastic walls. For women travelers, especially, monasteries could be sanctuaries where the risks of harassment were minimized. 3. The social and cultural role. Why were monasteries so important in the medieval travel network? Anchors of hospitality. Along pilgrimage routes, like the Camino de Santiago in Spain or the Road to Canterbury in England, monasteries formed a chain of rest stops. They were often strategically placed about a day's walk apart. For peasants making pilgrimages, these institutions made the journey physically possible. Centers of learning and medicine. Monasteries were not just shelters. They sometimes offered care. Monastic infirmaries treated sick travelers with herbs and basic remedies. Literacy among monks also meant that important messages, letters, or documents could be written or read for illiterate peasants. Moral and religious education. For a peasant, staying at a monastery was not just about food and shelter. It was about exposure to a larger spiritual world. Listening to monks chant prayers or hearing a homily might leave lasting impressions. The monastery was a reminder that travel was also a spiritual journey. Tensions with the secular world. It should be said that monasteries were not universally welcoming. Hospitality was encouraged by Christian teaching, but in practice, abbots had to balance generosity with resources. In times of famine or war, guest houses could close or refuse peasants who had nothing to offer. There are records of monasteries turning away beggars when resources ran dry. Storytelling moment. A night in the monastery. Imagine yourself again, a peasant traveler. After days of road dust and aching feet, you see the tall stone walls of a monastery. You knock at the gate, and after a moment, a monk in a brown robe opens. He looks at your weary face, your ragged clothes, and silently beckons you in. Inside, the air smells of herbs and fresh bread. A novice guides you to a simple bench by the fire. Soon, you are handed a bowl of thick soup, steam rising into your face. Around you, monks eat in silence while one brother reads scripture aloud. It is not a place for merriment, but for peace. That night, you lie on straw in a small chamber, the walls bare, the only sound a distant chant of monks at midnight prayer. You sleep deeply, not because the bed is soft. It is not, but because you feel safe, wrapped in the order of a sacred place. Reflection and modern parallels. What do monasteries teach us about human hospitality? Unlike inns, where survival depended on coins, monasteries embody the principle. The traveler is sacred. The stranger carries the face of Christ. For peasants, this was both relief and dignity. In our world today, few of us knock on monastery doors for shelter, yet echoes remain. In hostels run by churches, in community shelters, in hospitals founded by religious orders. Even the idea of volunteer-run soup kitchens has its roots in the monastic impulse to give without asking much in return. Part 4, Barns, alehouses, and open skies. Introduction. When doors close. Not every peasant on the road had the luck to find an inn with space or a monastery with open gates. Many nights ended in far humbler shelters, or no shelter at all. Imagine walking until your legs tremble, asking at a tavern only to be waved away, or reaching a monastery only to hear, "We have no room." What then? The answer was simple and rough. A barn corner, an alehouse bench, or the open sky itself. These were not glamorous stops, nor especially safe, but they were the common reality for countless medieval peasants who journeyed with empty pockets. In this section, we'll explore 3 such last resort options. Barns and byres, sleeping with livestock. Alehouses and informal drink shops. Warmth, noise, but little security. The open road, ditches, hedgerows, and campfires under the stars. 1. Barns and byres, beds of straw. Practicality. Farmers across medieval Europe built barns to store grain or shelter animals. For a desperate traveler, the open structure of barns offer a hiding place. Peasants often begged permission to sleep on straw, but others slipped in without asking. Conditions. Warmth. In winter, barns were sometimes the warmest option. Livestock bodies radiated heat. Comfort. Straw provided better bedding than bare ground, though fleas and vermin were constant companions. Safety, half safe. Farmers sometimes tolerated strangers, but theft and suspicion meant travelers risked being chased away. Or worse, beaten as intruders. Example, storytelling moment. Picture a peasant woman named Alice, traveling with her child. Night falls, and the innkeeper shakes his head. No coin, no bed. She trudges to a nearby farm and timidly knocks. The farmer frowns, then relents. "The barn, if you keep quiet." Inside, cows shift and snort. She spreads straw, wraps her child, and listens to the animals breathe. The barn becomes both cradle and refuge. Cultural meaning. Sleeping in a barn blurred the line between hospitality and trespass. It reflected rural life's communal rhythms, animals, humans, and strangers all seeking shelter together. 2. Alehouses and informal drink shops. What were alehouses? Unlike inns, which catered to wealthier travelers, alehouses were small, often just someone's front room where home-brewed ale was sold. They were scattered everywhere, especially in villages. Atmosphere. Loud, smoky, earthy. Laughter, gossip, dice games, and arguments filled the air. Social hub. Villagers came not just to drink, but to exchange news. For travelers, alehouses were semi-public spaces where strangers could slip in, buy a cup, and perhaps be allowed to doze by the fire. Sleeping in an alehouse. No beds, only benches or floors. Owners might allow a traveler to stay if they bought ale. Safety was mixed. Drunken fights, theft, and rowdy patrons were common. Storytelling moment. A peasant man named Godric stumbles into an alehouse after dusk. He has 1 copper coin. He orders the cheapest cup of ale and nurses it slowly. Around him, men argue about sheep prices. Someone sings off-key. The fire crackles. Godric pretends to sleep with his head on the table. When the house finally empties, the owner sighs and throws a ragged blanket his way. It isn't generosity. It's just easier than throwing him into the night. Historical note. Alehouses face criticism from authorities. Preachers warned of sin, drunkenness, and disorder. Yet for poor peasants, they were often the only indoor refuge available without a heavy fee. 3. The open road under the stars. When barns were locked and alehouses closed, peasants had no choice but to sleep outside. Locations: under hedgerows along fields, in roadside ditches, on common land where travelers lit small fires. Risks: weather, rain, frost, and wind made nights brutal. Robbers: travelers were vulnerable to theft or violence. Wild animals: wolves lingered in parts of Europe. Stray dogs were a nuisance. Survival tactics: cloaks doubled as blankets. Groups of peasants often slept together for safety. Fires, if fuel was available, offered both warmth and warning against animals. Storytelling moment: 3 young men, traveling to find seasonal work, lay huddled in a ditch. One keeps watch while the others sleep. They whisper about their dreams, better wages, maybe a chance to buy a pig. Overhead, stars glitter. The road is hard, but the conversation itself is a kind of comfort. Cultural symbolism: sleeping under the sky symbolized vulnerability. For the poorest peasants, the open road was both freedom and danger. No walls confined, no roof to protect. It was the ultimate reminder of their marginal place in society. 4. Why these shelters mattered. Though rough, barns, alehouses, and open-air sleeping were vital survival strategies for peasants. They represented adaptability. Peasants had to negotiate with strangers, plead for mercy, or make do with nature. Community ties. Barns and alehouses reflected how rural people managed strangers, sometimes with suspicion, sometimes with grudging kindness. The thin line between shelter and exposure. Unlike monasteries or inns, these spaces offered no certainty. They mirrored the precariousness of peasant life itself. Reflection, then and now. Looking back, it is tempting to pity those who slept in barns or roadside ditches. Yet, perhaps we should also see their resilience. The medieval peasant carried little, depended much, and endured nights of cold or fear with remarkable toughness. Even today, echoes remain. Rural migrants in many parts of the world still sleep in temporary sheds, train stations, or open fields. Modern barns and alehouses take the shape of bus shelters, cheap diners, or public parks where the exhausted find a corner of rest. There is a quiet dignity in this endurance, the ability to lie down in imperfect places, to wake up and keep moving forward. As we close this journey through medieval roads, barns, monasteries, and alehouses, it is easy to imagine peasants as shadows of the past, silent, tired, forgotten. Yet behind every dusty footstep was a story. A mother clutching her child in a barn, a laborer sharing laughter by the fire of an alehouse, a wanderer tracing consolations from a ditch beside the road. These were not grand histories carved into stone, but living moments of survival and resilience. For the poor, a place to stay was not guaranteed, but sought, negotiated, or endured each night. The reality was fragile, yet within that fragility lay the heartbeat of humanity itself. The need for warmth, for belonging, for a corner of safety where one could close tired eyes. Looking back, what strikes us is not only their hardship, but their quiet strength. They made homes where none existed. A pile of straw became a bed. A tavern bench became a resting place. Even the open sky, harsh and cold, could be transformed into a blanket of stars when shared with fellow travelers. And perhaps that is why these stories still matter. They remind us that comfort is never to be taken for granted, that the simple act of resting safely tonight is a privilege built on centuries of struggle. They also remind us that in every age, humans adapt, share, and endure together. If you close your eyes now, you might almost hear it. The muffled sound of animals shifting in a barn, the laughter spilling from a village alehouse, or the whisper of the wind along the road at midnight. These sounds are echoes of a past that shaped the very rhythms of life. So as you drift into rest tonight, carry this thought with you. History is not just about kings and battles. It is also about ordinary people, walking weary miles, finding shelter in the most unexpected places, and still choosing to rise the next morning. Thank you for joining me on this gentle walk through time. If you'd like to continue exploring the quiet, human side of history, the stories that comfort as much as they teach. Be sure to subscribe and stay with us for the next chapter. There are countless more forgotten corners to uncover together. Sleep well, and let the echoes of the past keep you company tonight.